Yeah. Welcome back to this third part of a three-part series of faith and art in the 17th century. And welcome back, Professor Rafferty. It's good to have you with us once again, and we look forward to hearing about what was going on in the UK. So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. So this is the third in a three-part series. They're all on YouTube, so you can go back and review the other ones, but they all kind of stand on their own. There have been kind of case studies where I've looked at Catholicism, especially in Italy, and among especially sculpture and sculptural ensembles and architectural sculpture. Last week we turned to an examination of the Reformed Church, specifically Calvinistic Amsterdam, where there was a wonderful dialogue between different, not only different denominations, but also between Jews and Christians in that period. Now, the English Reformation is complicated. And it doesn't so much have its own theology as it's more an approach to the already existing Protestant and Catholic ideologies that are current at the time. And because probably everybody recognizes the English Reformation, but I'm just going to do a very, very fast review of it, just for those that may be out there, like my nephew and other people, Catholics, that might be seeing it. Henry VIII, a beautiful portrait by Hans Holbein, basically didn't have much of a doctrinal problem with the Roman Catholic Church, but wanted an annulment to his marriage so he could marry another woman. And he got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer, who went along with it. He asked the Pope for an annulment. The Pope wouldn't give it. He went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he did grant him an annulment. And thus the English Reformation was born. Cranmer translated the Mass and Matins, morning prayer, into the Book of Common Prayer, the beautiful Shakespearean language of his time. And also at the back of the Book of Common Prayer are the 39 Articles of Religion that he also wrote that summarize his approach to this via media. One of the interesting things about it, it differentiates it from both the Calvinists and the Lutherans on the mainland, was that there was an unbroken chain of bishops. This is an idea called apostolic succession. And the idea being that Christ laid his hands on the apostles, they laid their hands on the next generation of bishops, who laid their hands on the next generation of bishops, and so forth, in an unbroken line. The Roman Catholic Church has this, the Greek Orthodox and so forth also have this, but Luther wasn't able to talk many bishops. In Sweden, I guess there were a few, but basically he just promoted people to being bishops without it being part of the apostolic succession. That didn't bother him because he believed in the priesthood of all believers. But in the Anglican tradition, the priesthood was unbroken. By the Reformation, the succession of bishops continued unabated. And so really, although Henry is often credited with the Reformation, and he was a major influence in it, he studied to be a priest. He didn't want to be the king originally, and his brother died, his older brother. So Cranmer's a man that I admire a great deal because he was able to take the Latin of the Mass and spin it into this beautiful English. But one of the problems was the successor. They had begun to, and they allowed priests to marry. I forgot that was an important part. Cranmer felt, Greek Orthodox priests marry. Christ never said anything about not getting married. Peter was married because Christ visits the mother-in-law of Peter. You don't have a mother-in-law unless you're married. So he saw no reason not to get married. And many of the churchmen at that time had their secret mistresses on the side and their illegitimate children. But Cranmer felt like, no, I love this woman. I want my children to be legitimate. There's nothing. And so he allowed priests to marry, and priests began to marry. Well, then the successor, Mary Tudor, Mary I, who's been dubbed Bloody Mary, was a vehement Catholic, and she wanted to return the Reformation, overturn the Reformation. She had the Archbishop burned at the stake, for example, and annulled the marriages of priests and so forth and so on. It was a very bloody but short routine. She was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth the First. And Elizabeth had a very interesting idea of how to organize this controversy between high churchmen that were Protestants, Catholic people that wanted to return to the papacy, Calvinists were very organized in England as the Puritan evangelicals. And Elizabeth declared the idea of a broad church. We would all use the same prayer book that Cranmer came up with, but how we interpret it is going to be up to the individual. So in some parishes, there were more elaborate rituals that seemed kind of more Catholic, and in other parishes, there were more Protestant feeling things. And this continues to today as you go to like All Angels Church and compare that to St. Stephen's, Christ and St. Stephen's, or St. Mary the Virgin, the very high church. So this concept of a broad church was an important thing because as long as they were united on the creeds and the catechism and the prayer book, that the church would put aside its own preferences for how exactly you celebrate the sacraments. And this was a good idea. So there didn't end up, for example, with the Eucharist, if I'm not mistaken, there's not one particular Anglican way of thinking of it. Opinions as to how the Eucharist is the body of Christ are varied from priest to priest, from parish to parish, from individual to individual. Some believing it's just a recreation of the Last Supper in a very Calvinistic sort of way, whereas others believe actually in transubstantiation of the actual change of substance, like the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox believe. So there's a broad range of things that can all be tolerated. And this, I think, is the great wisdom of the Anglican Church, is this broad avenue, is this via media that can take in different aspects of Christianity and integrate it into a greater whole that kind of supersedes both, the Calvinists of the Reformed Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so let's get in. I don't want to spend too much time in the 1500s because I want to really dive into Baroque architecture, just as we had looked at sculpture in the Italy, and we had concentrated on painting in the Dutch Republic. Let's look at architecture. And architecture is dominated by two architects from the period, Christopher Wren, who did this beautiful old folks home for retired naval officers. But what I want to call your attention to is the very humble building in the very center. This is one of the very first Baroque buildings. You might think, boy, it's really very stripped down. It's not very ornate. It has a sort of chaste, almost modest quality to it that's so different than the more flamboyant Baroque of the Italians. Although there's that wonderful stairway that belies its elegance and its Baroqueness. If we go around to the back, this beautiful porch with a portico there and a balustrade along the top. We notice that the first story is rusticated, so that there's heavier stone that's more rough, and that there's a string chorus, and then the second floor, the piano nobile, it has these pillars and then a balustrade at the very top. The whole thing is lifted up so that there's a stairway on the other side. Now, this is very, very influenced, and this is Inigo Jones. Inigo Jones traveled to Italy, but he didn't go to Rome. He went rather to the environs of Venice, and especially he was influenced by Andrea Palladio. And this is the Villa Rotonda, domestic architecture of the highest quality from the late 1500s. And notice that although it has some decoration, we see some sculpture and so forth, it has a much more chaste, a much more humble, a much more kind of classical quality. And classicism has been defined by Winckelmann as quiet grandeur and noble simplicity, balance, harmony, order, reason. These are the sort of things that drove Palladio in his high Renaissance domestic architecture. And this classical sort of Baroque, not the flamboyant or Baroque of Italy, is what they went for. Now, in London was a medieval town, and it had largely dominated by half-timbered housing like this. And this is a village in France, but it gives you an idea of what London was like before the Great Fire of 1666. And it you know, a lot of wood, and so it would burn. Into this very medieval-looking London is this incredible banqueting hall, also by Inigo Jones. Now, this was part of the palace of the king, of King Charles I, but it's the only thing that survived. But it survived intact. It's like a miracle. And it really is a beautiful, stately, uplifting building. Now, if we look at the front, the facade is very classical in that it's balanced and harmonious. The and it very ever so slightly reaches out into our space, because the central, I'm trying to get my thing here, the central three windows, both on the first floor and the second floor, have fully articulated pillars that come out. But beyond that, it's a straight, it goes straight. And these are pilasters, or those flattened pillars. And at the end, as if it were a hymn or a piece of music, he puts double pilasters, as if to signal this is the end. There's a musical quality, I think, to Jones and to Wren and to Palladio, for that matter. There's a stately, measured quality that reminds me not so much of Monteverdi and opera of the time, but more of the slightly later, very rational music of Bach. I think of those, you know, those chorales, but also his polyphonic music, which is very rational, even though it's complicated, and always comes to a sort of harmonious close. So I think that this is a very nuanced building. It's not a building that jumps out at you with drama or anything like that, but it has a measured quality. It has a stateliness. It has a reserved. Now, that is not that it's without ornamentation entirely, but it doesn't throw itself headlong into ornamentation the way the Italians would do. I wanted to mention too how the entrance is actually on the side to the left, but notice the whole thing too is lifted up, so that there's that rusticated floor as the basement floor that we see from the side. So the whole thing has this uplifting quality. So when you enter the banqueting hall, it's really a beautiful building. And this is a wonderful photograph, because, you know, very often in London, it's dark and gloomy. And this was a very bright day, apparently. And it really shows off the whiteness and the purity and the harmony and that noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. Now, back there where that red cloth is, that's where the king, Charles I, would greet people to the banqueting hall. And we have to imagine it illuminated by, where there are chandeliers there, but also great candelabras and tables and so forth, because that's really what it was. It was for large affairs of state where there were banqueting. And he got the very best painter in Europe, the most, Peter Paul Rubens, to do the ceilings. And we're not going to look at the ceilings. We're not going to get into painting too much. And Rubens is a Catholic, but he's willing to bring in the Catholics if they're the ones that do the stuff. And this is about the apotheosis of his father, who's flying up into heaven. But what I want to compare it to is the roughly contemporaneous Versailles in France. And this is the Hall of Mirrors. It's not a banqueting hall. It's just kind of a show hall And on one side, where the windows are the formal gardens of Versailles. And or as when my first job was in Kansas, and they always want to pronounce it Versailles because there's a Versailles, Kansas. And so my students in Kansas always would say it, and then I correct them. They just go, oh, roll their eyes, Versailles. Anyway, as in Versailles, look at the lush ornamentation. By the way, the ceiling decorations are also by Rubens here. So here, King Louis brought them in. But look at the crystal chandeliers, these statues of either cherubs holding up braziers of fire, a beautiful, what do you call it, parquet floor, and mirrors, one side windows, the other side colossal mirrors that just endlessly reflect everything. It said that King Louis XIV used to ride. He'd get his horse and ride through the hall of mirrors so he could see himself riding in the mirror. Bless you. A true
Thank you.
narcissist.
Sorry.
A true narcissist. And we're familiar with narcissistic leaders here. But I just take a look at this with all the gold and all the stucco. And I'm not denying that it's beautiful. It is. It's lush. And then, see that? I mean, that's really amazing. This has a sort of nobility and a restraint and a balance and reason. It's, as I said, there is ornamentation, but the ornamentation is very localized into certain things, as if we're organizing a complex fugue, but want to have a basic kind of basso continuo that gives the overall rhythm and kind of is the key signature. I find this very musical. I'd love to see a concert in the banqueting hall, and I think they sometimes do have concerts in there. Well, this is Charles I, and this is a painter. Now, Charles I, he brought in the very best, like Rubens. His student, Anthony van Dyck, did this picture of the king. He was the court artist to Charles I. Charles I was very short. He was 5'3", so he liked big hats and high-heeled shoes and stuff like that. And here, to flatter him, the artist gets down like on his knees, literally in front of him. So because the horizon line is where that's the viewer's sight line. So he's literally kneeling beneath this very short king who looks very, very grand. And I love how his elbow sticks out at us, just like the Caravaggio that we saw in the first thing. Very haughty. He's there with his horse. A beautiful, beautiful painting. And it shows that I think it reveals a lot about his character. He had a difficult time because he was trying to balance, on the one hand, the left wing of the Protestants, the Calvinists, who were calling for an end to the papism and so forth, that they thought that the Reformation had not gone far enough. His wife was a French princess. He originally was courting the Habsburg. He went to Spain when he was a young man, and they were unsuccessful in negotiating a marriage with the Habsburgs. But when he was in Spain, he met Rubens and he met Velázquez. And England is very much backwater at that time. And the court of Spain was the center of everything. And so he was very influenced by that. And he thought, I'm going to bring these people to England if we can't find the native talent to do it. But he ended up marrying a French princess, and here she is. And she remained a Catholic, which of course rubbed the more radical Calvinists the wrong way. Here you have the King of England, the head of the church, and his wife's a Catholic. They built, this is the Queen's chapel. It was associated with St. James Palace, and it's still there. And it was a pre-revolutionary thing. It was a chapel built for her, for the Catholic tradition by Palladio. By Inigo Jones. I think it's really his only church. And we get a very clear idea of this classical language that he's using with great restraint. You can see the parish church there, and I guess the parish hall next to it. When you go inside the little chapel, he brightly illuminates it with these light. The interior was redesigned by Christopher Wren in the period after the restoration of the church, and he redecorated it in more of a sort of middle of the road classical way. But you can see that there is, and this wonderful reredos that encircles it in the back. It's a wonderful kind of compromise between the Catholic and Protestant way of doing things. Well, as you're probably aware, and as I warned you, the English Reformation is complicated. The king was accused of collaborating with Irish Catholics to invade, to overturn the Puritans, who were the dominant force in Parliament. And they accused him of treason and tried him and beheaded him. So he was really the first monarch who was beheaded. And this grisly engraving from the time shows the beheading of the king, and right there in the very graphic terms there. And I brought it in because he was executed right in front of that banqueting hall. And you can see banqueting house behind him. So it formed the backdrop. Then there was, the church also went into hiding, and Oliver Cromwell, who's a Lord Protector, who was from Parliament, there began a civil war between the king and the Puritans. For a while, they won, and they imposed a Calvinistic aesthetic on everybody. But and I know this is very fast, but this is Charles II, who had taken refuge in France, and you see how Frenchified he is when he returns. He looks like rivaling King Louis XIV himself, decked out in the full array with that wonderful hat that he holds in his hand so gallantly. Now, he was called the Merry King, although I wasn't able to find any pictures of him that look very merry. But that was perhaps he was overcompensating, because he actually, unlike the Puritans, so there's no wine and there was no nude pictures, and there was no even hymns or organ in church. Everything was very pure. He was a lush in the midst of all this, and he loved opera. And this is the time of Henry Purcell, the great composer who died tragically young. So it was that generation of the Baroque, of the Restoration. And the church was restored. It had gone into hiding in France, but was restored. The priesthood continued. The Puritans left on the Mayflower, basically. And but in 1666, a very portentous year because of those predictions in the book of Revelation about 666 as the sign of the beast. And people were wondering what was going to be happening in 1666. By the way, this is something that also gripped the Jewish community in Amsterdam, who similarly had these messianic sort of, it's a very interesting period. Anyway, back to England, there was a great fire that was started in a bakery and quickly spread. And this was a town, as I said, that was made of timbered houses. And this is a later illustration, but everything burst into flames, including the great Gothic cathedral that had been there for 1,000 years in the background being consumed by fire. Here you can see the Gothic architecture of the period with these half-timbered houses. Don't see that so much in England anymore. So what this created was a tabula rasa. It completely leveled the playing field. Here was London. It had been reduced to cinders. And Christopher Wren, who was a chemistry professor at the University of Oxford, was called in to be an architect. He was one of the first professional architects. This isn't by him, by the way. But he was tasked with rebuilding over 60 churches that had been destroyed in the fire. And his greatest challenge was to to somehow to rebuild St. Paul's, the great cathedral, the Gothic cathedral. And so well, I brought this in, and this is a little, this is from the Midwest, it's the 19th century, but it's a Gothic church. And I wanted to bring in this steeple, the Gothic of a small church with steeples. And they wanted to have something that was connected to the past. And so he kind of reinvented the steeple, looking at Bernini, looking at certain precedents, but doing a very classical, a very un-Gothic, a very kind of new and classical kind of steeple, like here at St. Mary Le Beau. And you can see, let's see, I think I have a close up. Here's an engraving. Sometimes things are clearer in engravings because, London is very built up with skyscrapers and so forth. And sometimes you get a better view of the buildings from engravings. But this marvelous steeple, and there's a bell tower, of course, there are bells in there. But here he does, again, the double pilasters on the end, and then a lantern on the top that has a rounded part and then goes up to a steeple. All the decoration is classical. It's derived from the Greco-Roman language of form: pilasters, engaged columns, hanging cornices, rotundas, that kind of thing, but in a very stately sort of way. And as I said, it reminds me almost of like a Handel, adagio. It has a stately sort of, as it rises up to heaven. So it's really amazing how he was able to not just rebuild all this Gothic, they were not going to do that anymore. And so he has a great hand in rebuilding and reshaping London, greater than anybody else until recent times. So in the same way that Rome is kind of Bernini's city, in many ways London is, or at least was, Wren's city, because he helped rebuild it in this new classical style. St. Magnus the Martyr is another one of these churches, also in London, a beautiful bell tower. I'm kind of bringing in some different, because he was endlessly creative with these bell towers, and there's over 60 of them that he built. He was an incredibly prolific architect. He just took over and rebuilt the city from scratch. I wanted to show you, and this is, they put up a skyscraper, right across from it. So it really, and this is, look at the buildings in the background. There's the Thames in the background as well. I love London, but it is a crazy quilt. As I said, sometimes these engravings from the 19th century give you a better idea. A very low, a very small church, but a very massive tower for the size of the church. The tower equaling the width of the narthex as you come into this church. And it just lifted up on one thing after another, the balustrade up there, the bells and the lantern on the top, piercing up to heaven. So it still has that Gothic sort of thing of verticality, but now done in a classical Renaissance language of form, a Greco-Roman classicism, to show restraint and to show order and balance and harmony, and to be a modern. This was a modern. One of the most memorable of these wonderfully creative spires is St. Bride's Church, also in London. And it was a cake maker in the 1700s who first invented the bride's cake, the wedding cake. That's a multi-tiered cake, and it was inspired by him looking at this tower, which I thought was a charming story. And of course, it's St. Bride's, and St. Bride doesn't necessarily have anything to do with brides, but it's stuck in the mind. All you need is a bride and groom on the top of it. I'm not showing you the interiors because very often the interiors have been remodeled in different ways that don't really clearly show Wren's classicism. But one in which I think the interior is mostly intact, and it gives you a real idea of Wren at his most powerful, I think, is at St. Stephen's Walbrook. And again, with these skyscrapers right up next to them, it's hard to sort of isolate this church, which is very austere and plain on the outside. It has a wonderful bell tower that's kind of based on Bernini's bell towers from St. Peter's in Rome. but it's this dome structure. And I have, and here's an engraving of it that shows it maybe a little more clearly, but I want to go into the interior. Here's an ingenious, photo montage that shows the kind of classical interior in the dome structure. Um, Boy, it is, talk about balance, harmony, order. It's decorated, but in a very kind of minimal sort of way, allowing a lot of fenestration and not clouding up with colored glass, but also not having it completely clear. It's etched glass so that it's sort of, what do you call it, translucent. It lets in all the light, but you don't see all the traffic and stuff so clearly outside of it. And the high altar at one time was against the east wall that we're looking at now. But I want you just to take a look at this and then see the interior of a Gothic church. And I've kind of, and here, much darker, much more decorated, stained glass windows, a lot of decoration, but dark, despite the giant windows. Look at how different this is. I mean, much less spooky, you know? And so it does seem very much kind of like this. I mean, one way to read this is, the dark sort of Middle Ages and sort of the light of reason coming in, flooding in to influence the people and give them a feeling of completeness with this dome. And the dome is decorated, but in a tasteful and kind of restrained manner. The proportions are very, very nice in this church. I also contrasted with the whitewashed churches of the Netherlands, which we looked at last week. These churches were Catholic Gothic churches with tapestries on the walls, with frescoes, with statues, with stained glass windows, and they were basically denuded of all that. But what I find, and I find these beautiful in their own way, but there is a naked quality, and I don't know exactly what I mean by that, but it's stripped bare. And it has a certain kind of pleasing simplicity, especially for people like me who like modern architecture. But look at how much richer Rennes interior is. It's not a Gothic church that all the decoration has been removed, but rather decoration is like tastefully integrated into the overall composition, which gives you and there's a oculus at the top too, so you get a nice. I mean, there's a lantern at the top, so it illuminates it. It's a very luminous church. To contrast with Bernini's, we looked at a couple of weeks ago, Bernini's Santa Maria del Vittoria, and here every wall is colored marble, stucco angels, gold settings to everything, a darker interior than it really shows here. But look at how much more restrained and dignified and sort of take a nice breath with Rennes. I hope I'm doing okay here. Architecture is the toughest thing to teach. Painting's the easiest because you just have a two-dimensional image. And if you get an idea of its scale, you can envision it pretty well. Sculpture, if you get enough different photographs of it, you can kind of get a sense of its wholeness, but it's very difficult to really give you a sense of what an interior is like. And this is why a lot of times when I teach architecture, I try to get films where you're moving through the architecture, because I think that gives it a better, you have a more of a feeling of being in the space. But this is a space that above all is serene, is dignified, is decorated tastefully, and embodies balance, harmony, order, unity, and clarity. All of these ideas. I want to point out that they have repurposed this space, and I don't know whether I like it or not, but it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. But the altar was taken from the east wall. I guess there's maybe a small altar there still, but here is a marble altar directly under the dome. And so folding chairs have been arranged around it so that when they have mass, it's in the round. And the altar itself, and look at kind of how surrealistic and biomorphic it looks. It's not made of rubber or anything like that. It's marble, but it's by the very eminent Henry Moore. I think arguably the greatest 20th century artist coming out of Britain. And you're probably familiar with his work. I'm not sure how well it works in this kind of classical setting, have this sort of biomorphic uh, thing in the middle of it. And I'm not crazy about reorienting it, but I understand why they want to reorient the Mass and make it more inclusive. So I understand liturgically what they're doing, but the purist in me, as far as an architecture, would like to see it restored to the way that he intended it. These beautiful brass lamps, I think, are also beautiful and illuminated wonderfully at night. These are great places to come for concerts. Here's another church. This is St. Margaret Lothbury. And this one, it's interesting because the outside is so plain. It has the most Gothic looking steeple of any of the little churches we've looked at so far. And it's very modest on the outside, like a good Christian, right? But the inside is very rich and decorated. And this interior, I guess, is one of the more authentic interiors. And that's why I've been restrained about showing you interiors unless I can get you something, really get you the feeling of the 1600s. And here, this elaborate woodwork and the pulpit and so forth are all part of it. Notice that there are paintings, and I'm not sure where they look to me like 19th century, but they might be from the Renaissance because it does look like from maybe they were salvaged from the earlier church. Where an altarpiece would normally be right above the altar is instead the Ten Commandments, written out in English. And then the altar, as you can see, is decorated with a beautiful cloth and a cross and so forth. This is very different than the very plain communion table of the Calvinists and this is from Switzerland. But so there is a Catholic kind of quality to this that mirrors the broad church approach of the theology, that just as it's a large tent, so to speak, and that different people might have different interpretations, for example, of the meaning of the Eucharist, of how exactly Christ is present in the Eucharist, but the church lays aside its own preferences. And as long as everyone can follow the Book of Common Prayer, they can get along together. And I think this is really an advanced sort of way of thinking. Okay, so there's also a side altar to Mary. And again, now I'm not sure if this comes under if this was really an authentic aspect of the 17th century church, or if this is a later redecoration. I wasn't able to find that out investigating on the internet. Those paintings look like 19th century paintings to me, but it's just, a really educated guess when I'm looking at it. In the 19th century in England, there was the Oxford movement, which was a very Catholic sort of movement. And so some churches, like your neighboring church up there in the 80s, St. Ignatius of Antioch, it's very Roman Catholic almost. If you go there, it reminds me of the Catholicism of my boyhood. But again, this broad church kind of thing. So that's the side. Well, Christopher Wren's greatest challenge of his life and his greatest legacy to architecture was St. Paul's Cathedral. And it was finished in an extraordinary 35 years. 35 years sounds like a long time, but really compared to St. Peter's, which took hundreds of years to put together, this really went very fast and very much reflects the taste and it was the epitome, really, the greatest challenge of his career is to crown all those 60-some churches in London with this magnificent new St. Paul's. Now, the old St. Paul's, and, of course, now it's surrounded by, skyscrapers. And this is a painting from the 1700s, but it shows, the kind of grand magnificence it had against that kind of skyline. This is Old St. Paul's. And Old St. Paul's was a Gothic building with a long choir, kind of a short arms to it, and a Gothic spire. This is an engraving of the interior, and you can see all those pointed arches that are characteristic of Gothic architecture. So it was a Gothic cathedral. It was so compromised by the Great Fire of 1666 that it was found to be not salvageable. And so Wren decided to completely tear it down, not even try to restore it, and instead would put up a new cathedral greater than any of the earlier ones, but not in the Gothic style, the new classicizing style. And his original design for it was this. And this is this magnificent model in wood that is actually in the cathedral. You can go see this when you're there. It's a beautiful model made under Wren's supervision. And this was his original design for it. It was to be a centrally planned church. That is, didn't have a long nave or a long choir like the old church did, but was centrally planned around a central dome. There would be there's an arcade in the front, and then what do you call this, a narthex in here, and then you could emerge into this magnificent, very, very large church. It was very much a takeoff on Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's. Now, after Michelangelo died, Michelangelo did the dome and designed kind of, you want to get a good view of St. Peter's and what Michelangelo thought, go around to the back of St. Peter's, back here, because the front was all Baroqueized. They extended the nave and Bernini made the piazza in front and so forth. This is what Michelangelo did. And notice the walls kind of undulate in and out. It has a robustness to it. And so he's, is looking at this. But I think Wren's plan is even more daring because he has these concave arches in the corners here that in the model you can see. This is a very radical sort of space. It would have been interesting to see how this would have, played itself out. Part of this concave has to do with influence from Bernini, because although Wren never went to Italy at all, he did go to France, and he was in Versailles, and he was in Paris at the time of that Bernini was visiting there. And Bernini was approached by King Louis XIV to design the palace at Versailles. And this is part of it. So he has this concave, there would have been a fountain there or something. They scrapped that idea. They did something else. But the boldness of Bernini, but in a more restrained and classical way that I think Michelangelo would have liked. It's almost as if, Bernini messed it up and he's going to go back to more of a Renaissance kind of a thing. Well, the committee did not like it. It was popish, it was hopelessly Catholic, and would not do it all. They wanted a long choir. So he came up with this kind of homely compromise. And it was bad enough that they all agreed they liked this. So this is what he did, but secretly in his mind, he kept some version of that earlier thing he was going to do. So what he did is he erected, besides the scaffolding, big canvas that covered up the construction area. So you couldn't see it from the street. So he was able to kind of proceed clandestinely in some ways, because he always had to be, he was afraid the money would run out. There was a tax that they imposed on coal, and that brought in the money. And he was afraid, one of the things he's afraid of is that when a church like this is built, you can build it in stages. And he was afraid if he finished this part up here by the altar, which is called the choir, that they might be satisfied with that because they could start saying masses, they might never finish it. And this was the fate of actually the Cologne Cathedral in Germany. They started it and they stopped, and it was just a little bit, and then they rebuilt it in the 19th century. So he was afraid that the funding would stop and then you never get to do his magnificent dome. But there were even greater problems than that. Okay, we'll talk about the dome presently. One of the things he had problems with is, and this is a Gothic cathedral, these things, my arrow, are called flying buttresses. The only reason you can have these big windows in a Gothic cathedral is that the walls are abutted by these flying buttresses that take the outward thrust and direct it down to the ground. And they're like spider legs kind of coming out of Gothic structures. He didn't want to have those things that looked Gothic. So what he did, flying buttresses he needed. So he put the flying buttresses in, you can see them a little bit here, and then he built a fake wall to surround it. And unless you get up on a helicopter, you can't see the falseness of it. And see how it widens it out into apparently a 2-story building, which it really isn't. It still allows fenestration. There's still windows in there. And this is part of the flying buttress, because it actually goes into the story below as well. So it's a full-blown flying buttress, and you can get up there like that. But from below, looks perfect, right? And he even does these, what they call blind windows up here. That is, it's divided up, but then the windows are stone. And it's good to stone because otherwise you'd see behind the scenes and see that this is kind of a sham wall. But how beautiful and stately it is, how balanced and harmonious. And I mean, it's really is an amazing kind of a thing that he achieves with it. But, okay, so they got it built up to this point, and he had started building the foundations for this rotunda area, the deep foundations. But he found out that the building began to sink, and that his dream of having a stone dome like St. Peter's was doomed, because the heaviness of having a stone dome would have cracked the foundations and the whole building would have tumbled down. So we had to find a way, if he's that dream of that dome is going to be there, he has to find a way of making it very light. Now, in St. Peter's, there's a dome within a dome. And the same thing in the Florence Cathedral. You can see there's a little space between it here. And there's actually a walkway that you can walk up, and I found a picture of the walkway. It's not for those who are claustrophobic. Also, you can't turn around. You know, it's one way. So you get halfway up, you're tired, you have a heart attack. I don't know if that ever happens, but it's very claustrophobic. It's not for everybody. But here he wouldn't dare do that. But he did have this lantern that was several tons. It was stone. It was already built. It was very, very heavy. So he figured, I have to make the rest of the dome light enough that somehow this lantern can be supported. And so what he did is he created a triple dome. It was a completely new concept. And there's the ostensible dome down here with an oculus in it. But then what he did is to reach the lantern with the least amount of heaviness, he made a brick cone-like structure. And you can see that he puts windows in the cone, see? So that, and here's a shot of what it looks like from inside. And you look like you can look up into that oculus into another thing, but that's painted, that's an illusion. Not this part. This part up in here is an illusion, because that's that brick cone that's been frescoed to look as if it's the inside of a dome. And it's actually like this. And there's a little ring you can see that you can get into this area here and look down. I did not do this because after climbing San Pietro, I said, I will never do one of these again. So when I was in London, I missed out on that. I know maybe some of you have done it. I just felt like if I'm 25, it'd be no problem. 65, it's a little tough, but here it gives you this idea. Then what he did is he built a wooden structure. So the dome is wood, it's very light. Compared to stone, it's very light. He needed these huge timbers. And they got these like 300-year-old oak trees to make these huge timbers. And then the thing itself is a shell of lead, very, very light, very light shell of lead. But and when you get all the way up there, you get this marvelous view of London. And here you can see the towers in the front as you're looking off toward the river. This is another view. And, London is such a futuristic town. It always looks to me like, the Jetsons. When I was a kid, there was a futuristic cartoon. They all, in the future. And London looks like that. It's really one of the most eccentric postmodern metropolises anywhere. And if you want to see a very trippy, unconventional thing that Tate Modern is a good example of postmodern architecture. By the way, a wonderfully, wonderfully tasteful thing is the addition that Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown did to the National Gallery. If you ever look at the addition there, it's very respectful of the original intentions. So here is the interior of St. Paul's. And if we look at it compared to St. Peter's, it's on a monumental scale. Similarly, not quite as large. It seems like everything, and this was my great impression when I walked in, it seemed like everything was a measured response to St. Peter's. That even though he'd never traveled to Rome, he had undoubtedly seen engravings of the interior. And he wanted to make something that was more classical, more restrained, and showed that kind of mediation, that kind of via media, that goes between the extravagances of the Catholic decoration and the stripped down, bare quality of Puritan architecture. And I think it makes an interesting comparison for us to stop at. And my first impression was, when I saw the interior of St. Paul's, I felt like the Monty Python guy and said, like, we're not going to have a silly cathedral like the Italians. We're going to have a more measured, classical and restrained building. And it just kind of felt like that. And I didn't mean to demean the building, but it really has that feeling. It's a very, very British, very kind of media, things going between. Okay, now one of the things that endears me to the Anglicans particularly is that they don't have a lot of, they're willing to accept a lot of different positions. And this is different than the Protestants we looked at last year of the Reformed Church in Amsterdam, where there were a great many different voices and different denominations operating all at once. But the Dutch Reformed Church had really a very patronizing attitude toward them. It allowed them to do their work, but they thought they're all going to go to hell. The broad church concept of Queen Elizabeth was much more inclusive and much less patronizing. It recognized the legitimacy of certain Catholic ideas and then the legitimacy of certain Protestant ideas and the ability to kind of go through in a measured way and a balance of all of them. But one of the things I find most attractive is the agnosticism of it, that the church can put aside its own preferences, its own personal interpretation of the meaning, for example, of the Eucharist, and just let it be a mystery without having to explain it. And it brings up one of my very favorite books, is God in Search of Man by Heschel in the 1950s, a Jewish mystic. But he talks about ignorance, and I thought I'd quote him here to close. Two kinds of ignorance, he says. There are two kinds of ignorance. The one is dull, unfeeling, barren, the result of indolence. The other is keen, penetrating, resplendent. From one, we seek to escape. In the other, the mind finds repose. The deeper we search, the nearer we arrive at knowing that we do not know. We could open up for questions if you'd like.
If you'll stop your screen share, then we can see one another. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much, Professor Raverty. It was some wonderful pictures, and we don't get a chance to really take that kind of a comprehensive look at Wren very often. I saw a lot of Wren monuments that were new to me. I think that you showed very effectively how reason entered into the Anglican Church as an important important factor. You know, the three-legged stool we're fond of saying of Anglican theology is scripture, tradition, and reason. And you can certainly see that in the architecture. But let me stop. That's probably enough, and ask if anyone has any questions. I would just then if I will just allow me to share one story about St. Ignatius of Antioch, our neighbor up the street, which is when the TV show 30 Rock needed a Roman Catholic church in one of their scenes to show a Roman Catholic funeral. They were unable to find a Roman Catholic church that looked Catholic enough, and they filmed the scene in St. Ignatius of Antioch.
Scapella Church.
Yeah. Yes. So I want to thank you very, very much. June, did you have a question before we go?
No, it's just a comment that the only two times I have gasped when I've walked into a building and stood in the center of it. The first was at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. When I stood there, I just couldn't take it all in. And the second was the first time I walked into a huge Walmart. I had never been inside a building like that. It's so different, but it's the same sense of being overwhelmed by the beauty and the other by the non-beauty.
Yes, yes. Both of them massive, but differently.
Yes, yeah.
Well, thank you again, Professor Raverty, for coming back. We look forward to the next time. You have really given us a lot to look at and think about. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.